Welcome to Reno Murders, Death in the Biggest Little City, the podcast where we peel back the glitter of the casinos and the neon lights to expose the darker stories hiding in Reno's shadow. So, welcome back. My name is Becca, and today we're heading back to 1976 when a nursing student at UNR vanished after her car broke down. Her name was Michele Mitchell. What happened to her set off decades of missteps, a wrongful conviction, and eventually tied Reno into a California serial killer case known as the Gypsy Hill Murders. So once again, everybody, buckle in because this one is a cocktail of tragedy, really bad policing, and forensic science most definitely doing its damn job. I'm not gonna lie here. When I was doing the research on this, it was jaw-dropping at moments. I mean, you can't make this stuff up. Michele was just 19 years old. She was a student at the University of Nevada here in Reno, so UNR. Friends described her as clever, caring, outgoing, and responsible, the kind of kid who doesn't belong in a true crime podcast. And yet, here we are talking about it. So, Michele, she was 5'5", she had a slender build, long blonde hair, parted down the middle, blue eyes. She has that girl next door look. That night, she was wearing a red sweater and blue jeans. On February 24th of 1976, Michelle's light blue Volkswagen Beetle, sidebar. I love this girl already, one of my favorite colors. And to who doesn't think a Beetle isn't the cutest little car for a young college student? However, let's not forget Ted Bundy drove a yellow Volkswagen Beetle. So for me, I can't look at a Volkswagen Beetle without thinking of that guy. Regardless, minus the Bundy situation, those cars are super cute. So, okay, back to our story. Michele's car broke down at 9th Street and Evans Avenue, right near the UNR campus, right over by where the Washoe County School District building is and the Museum of Natural History for UNR. So you definitely don't think of this being particularly unsafe, but I think more importantly, we need to point out this is right off of I-80, which for anyone who is not from this area, it's the main highway that runs you through Reno and goes into California. It was early evening and, just feel that February chill settling over Reno. So as headlights were cutting across Evans Avenue, witnesses saw Michele trying to push her Beetle, struggling to get it out of traffic. And shame on these people for not getting out and helping her push that Beetle out of traffic, but I digress. We know that she used a nearby phone booth to call her mother, asking for a ride, but no one heard from her again after that, and Michele never made it home. Hours later, her body was found in a garage of a small house on East 9th Street, just blocks from where her car had stalled. This makes me think that that home had to be right around East 9th and North Virginia Street, since that's where a good amount of older homes are. The homeowners were an elderly couple. They had gone out for the evening, and when they return, they find Michele's body in their garage, and they call the police. I think about my grandparents. I mean, dear Lord. They were not connected to Michele in any way. They opened their garage door expecting to park their car like always, and instead they find a bound and bleeding body of a 19-year-old nursing student. The scene was brutal. Her hands were tied, her throat was slashed. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment altercation. It was something far darker. This was deliberate, intimate violence, and it was terrifying because it happened right in the middle of a neighborhood that people thought was safe. Police were desperate to solve this, but they had no solid leads, and pressure mounted. Then came a bizarre confession from a woman named Kathy Woods. She was a mentally ill woman in Shreveport, Louisiana Psychiatric Hospital. So, again, I just want to point out, she's in a psychiatric hospital in Louisiana. So, Woods rambled about stabbing a girl near a college in Reno. I mean, who knows? She might have saw this on the news. She may have read it in the newspaper back then. But she rambled on about this. Instead of recognizing it as the complete ramblings of a confused individual with schizophrenia, Reno detectives decided they had their killer. Wow. Just wow, guys. I mean, come on. I'm not a cop, but really, Kathy Woods went on trial. There was no DNA, no fingerprints, no physical evidence at all. Just her words from inside a psych hospital. Shockingly, she was convicted. In 1984, she was retried because, well, she wasn't guilty and she had a team of advocates attempting to help her get exonerated. Sadly, they got the same result. She was convicted again. It was the 1980s. I suppose I'm not terribly blown away by this, but it is pretty unsettling. There were 2 trials, 2 convictions, 0 real evidence. I can't stress enough. Obviously, this is really scary to me. I think it probably is to anybody listening. I mean, all they had was just Kathy saying she stabbed a girl in Reno, but she wasn't even in Reno. She was in Louisiana. I know some people are not very good with geography, but Nevada is hell and gone from Louisiana. Kathy Woods ended up spending 35 years in prison, and this made her the longest incarcerated, wrongfully convicted woman in U.S. history. So remember that, because that's definitely not something to laugh about. Fast forward to 2014. Woods' attorneys in the Innocence Project pushed for DNA testing. Amazingly, there were cigarette butts collected near Michelle's body in 1976. They were able to test those with modern technology. The results, surprise, surprise, not Kathy Woods. Instead, the DNA hit on Rodney Halbower, a violent drifter already in prison in Oregon for attempted murder and a sexual assault. Bingo. The DNA link cleared Kathy Woods and tied Michelle's case to something much bigger. That something was the Gypsy Hill killings in California. Rodney wasn't a charmer like Ted Bundy, who I've mentioned prior, and I usually use him as reference because he's one of those serial killers that most people know of. And he wasn't good looking like Richard Ramirez, the Night Stalker. Again, mentioning him because most people know about him. But if you look at Richard Ramirez, just a little, again, sidebar here, he was only good looking once he got his teeth fixed because his teeth were seriously gross. So if you ever pull him up, look at the pictures before he got his crowns because yuck. But back to the story. Rodney, who we're talking about, Rodney was pure violence wrapped up in just mediocrity. He was a serial predator drifting between states. If you look him up, he looks sketchy and skeezy. And I have a hard time thinking any young lady would want to go anywhere with him. I mean, when I looked at him, he just gave me the complete ick factor. Rodney wasn't some criminal mastermind or slick Ted Bundy knockoff. He was the exact opposite. He's born in 1948 in Wisconsin, already behind the 8 ball with a crappy, unstable home life. The guy grew up marinating in chaos, violence, dysfunction, all of the fun stuff that practically writes the ending before the book even gets started. School, forget it. He drops out. The army, yeah, he's absolutely awful at that too. He goes AWOL, so he's not exactly G.I. Joe material. After that, he just drifts. Nevada, California, Oregon. Like a bad penny that nobody wants, but somehow it keeps showing up in your change. And here's the thing. He wasn't clever. He wasn't organized. He was sloppy, impulsive. He was the type of guy who lurked until opportunity practically tripped and fell into his lap. Women walking home, women waiting for a bus, women having car trouble like Michelle. That's when he'd strike. He didn't charm his way in. He didn't scheme for weeks. He just saw vulnerability and went full chaotic violence. If you're thinking, wow, that sounds disorganized, you're dead on. He is textbook. Disorganized killer. No planning, no finesse, just brutal spur-of-the-moment attacks. He left messes everywhere, blood, evidence, chaos. He didn't even bother hiding the monster inside because honestly, I don't think he cared. They don't need brains or charm to destroy lives. They just need opportunity. This should bring to mind the killer we talked about in our prior episode, episode 5, James Curry, the Reno Sheep's Flat mystery. It's basically the same guy, really. They have a different face, yes, different victims, yes, but same man behind the skin, or more like a monster behind the skin. The DNA clearly didn't just connect him to Michele and Reno, it connected him to several violent killings, which I mentioned are called the Gypsy Hill Murders. So where exactly were the Gypsy Hill Murders? These weren't backwoods killings or some dusty middle of nowhere crimes. Nope. These all went down in San Mateo County, California, right there on the peninsula just south of San Francisco. From Reno, we're looking at about a 4-hour drive, give or take traffic. You head west on I-80, you cross the bay, and you're basically in the backyard of Silicon Valley before Silicon Valley was even a thing. All of the victims I'm about to talk about all looked very similar. They were young, they were petite, they had long hair, it was parted in the middle. He had a thing for this type of look. The first victim, her name was Veronica Ronnie Casquillo, and I hope I'm not mispronouncing that. I am awful with last names, by the way, so my apologies ahead of time. Her friends called her Ronnie. She was 18, and she was found stabbed in a creek at Sharp Park Golf Course in Pacifica, right off Gypsy Hill Road. And that's where the whole Gypsy Hill Murders nickname came from. It's a dark little landmark right by the ocean. Then there's Tanya Blackwell, Tatiana, but her friends called her Tanya. She was only 14 years old. And anytime you talk about a minor, it just makes it even more disturbing. She vanished. Her body was dumped off the same Gypsy Hill Road in Pacifica. And that pattern, same place, same brutality, that locked in that name for good. Paula Baxter, only 17. She disappeared from her high school. They found her body behind a church nearby. Again, she's a teenager. She's vulnerable, just gone in an instant. Carol Lee, they called her Beatty. Her last name was Booth. She was 26, and she went missing in South San Francisco. Her body turned up later in a shallow grave near Colma Creek. Just imagine how many people drove past that spot every day without knowing what was buried nearby. And then there's Denise Lampy. Police do believe 100% that he is the one who killed this young lady. They just didn't pursue it because at this point he's in prison for life. But she was only 19. She was stabbed to death in her car at a mall parking lot in Daly City. Normal day spot. Again, just opportunity for him. So yes, 5 women, all killed within a tight little stretch of the peninsula, Pacifica to Daly City. These weren't scattered cross-country murders. This was all happening in the shadow of San Francisco at the time, a place most people think of for fog and sourdough bread and cable cars. But in the mid-1970s, San Mateo County had its own serial killer problem, and anybody who follows true crime definitely knows that. Halbower was finally convicted in 2018 for the murders of Veronica, Ronnie, and Paula Baxter, and sentenced to consecutive life terms in California. Nevada never retried him for Michele. The DNA match was enough, and he's never leaving prison, so they didn't go through with that. However, there is a lot of questions to be answered here, so let's get into that. All right, so time to walk through just how messy and violent Rodney's track record really was. And this is where I was talking about that when I was doing the research on this, I was just blown away, and not in a good way, because this guy wasn't some mysterious drifter lurking in the shadows. He was getting himself caught. He was escaping and getting rearrested. So many times, it's like his whole life was a revolving door of chaos. Again, jumping in a time machine, December 1975. we have him in Reno again. Clearly, he liked visiting the town. And if you're remembering, Michelle was murdered in 1976. Obviously, at that time, they did not know it was him. But in December of 1975, the year before, he attacks a blackjack dealer. He rapes her. By May of 1976, he is convicted and sentenced to life in Nevada State Prison. Nevada's criminal code in the mid-1970s was really tough, especially, which I don't think was a bad thing, especially when it came to sexual assault. So under those statutes of that era, a rape without substantial bodily harm could still trigger a life sentence, though if the offender might become eligible for parole after 10 years. If there was significant bodily harm, the sentence could be life without parole or life with parole after a longer period. So yeah, guilty of rape, even without extreme physical injury. We don't have those nasty details. Researching this guy, my guess is bodily harms. Regardless, it's life behind bars, not a slap on the wrist. And I think that's fantastic. But fast forward to 1977. He's serving time in Carson City, and anybody from the area knows Carson City is where a majority of the prisons are for Nevada, because Carson City is the capital, and also explaining that for everybody who is not from the area. And during a softball game, he literally escapes from prison. Yeah, escapes from a softball game. That tells you everything about prison security and just prison in general in the 1970s. So what does he do with his newfound freedom? He doesn't run far. Instead, he tries to kidnap his 7-year-old daughter. That was his big plan after breaking out. Authorities track him down and drag him back in because it's Halbower. And that's not the end of the story. Another guess here, I'm thinking he did not have a very high IQ, but I couldn't find any of that information in the research if anybody had tested this guy's IQ. But anyways, for a while, he sits in prison. But he's restless, right? Who isn't in prison? And by the mid-1980s, he's still got that pattern of bouncing between cells and getting into trouble. Then in 1986, he manages to pull off another escape. I'm reading this. I'm like, you've got to be kidding. I double checked this. It's factual. This time he climbs up onto a roof, scales the wall, and walks right out. Literally walks across the roof, slicing up chain link fences like a hot knife through butter, all while the tower guard apparently has a full view of the rooftop, but sees nothing. Talk about a security fail. Now, the Los Angeles Times report from December 15th, 1980 lays it out plain and simple. 2 inmates, he had an accomplice, 2 inmates convicted of sex crimes, climbed a wall, walked across a roof, cut through 2 chain link fences, and escaped from the state prison. Authorities said they passed within 40 feet of the tower guard, who has been resigned. Okay, no surprise there. So, yeah, this was no elaborate tunnel or inside job, just straight up roof walking, fence cutting, escape, and ghosting past a guard who apparently forgot his binoculars that day. Second time Rodney escapes. It was, again, from the exact same prison in Carson City. I triple checked that. I was thinking maybe it was a different prison. It was the same one. I did look into that prison, and for anybody who's wondering how this could happen twice, the prison was the state's main penitentiary at that time, and it was operating since 1860, notoriously outdated. And by the 1980s, it was already considered insecure, overcrowded, and crumbling. I guess that makes it a little bit easier to understand. And clearly they've built a new prison since then. So thank goodness for that, right? Moving ahead to December 1986, instead of laying low like some criminal genius, because as we know, this guy is not intelligent, he does the exact opposite. He steals the car, or a car, falls north to Jackson County, Oregon, and within days commits another violent assault. He rapes a woman and stabs her multiple times. But here's the twist, and thank goodness for the twist, she survives and later identifies him. By early 1987, law enforcement closes in on him, and he's arrested in Oregon, and he goes on trial. In March 1987, an Oregon jury convicts him of rape and attempted murder, striking the textbook disorganized, chaotic predator. Note, we've talked about it. Then they hand him a 15-year prison sentence for that assault. All right. Well, for a while, he sits tight, but sits tight and Rodney Halbower don't go together. He spends years shuffling between Nevada and Oregon's prison system, depending on who had jurisdiction at the moment. Think of him like a toxic, hand-me-down nobody wanted to keep, but nobody dared let go of. But a couple of decades go by, and the Gypsy Hill murders are still cold cases. The women, Veronica, everybody called her Ronnie, Paula Baxter, Carol Booth, Denise Lampe, and Tanya Blackwell are names with no justice. Then science catches up. By 2013, Oregon has him in custody, and they run his DNA through the national database. Yay, Oregon! And this is where the bombshell drops. The samples from two of the Gypsy Hill victims, Paula Baxter and Veronica, match Rodney's DNA. Suddenly, decades-old cases have a suspect. God, I love DNA. And all eyes swing back to this guy who's been hiding in plain sight behind bars the whole time. In 2014, California formally charges him. And in 2015, he's indicted for the Gypsy Hill murders. 2018, he finally goes to trial in San Mateo County, and the jury convicts him for those two killings. He's sentenced to 2 consecutive life terms without parole, which is fabulous. Yay, justice. When you line up Rodney against the so-called bigger names for serial killers, guys like Rodney Akala, the dating game killer, with his creepy fake charisma. And this guy gave me the creeps, but, a lot of people thought he was attractive. I mean, he did make it on the dating game, which, if you're not familiar with that, back in the 1970s, I think it was even the 1980s, it was a TV show. It's serial killer actually was a dating contestant on there. Or you compare Halbower to Richard Cunningham, the torso killer. He was meticulous in some ways, and he hid behind a suburban family role. Halbower, he couldn't fake normal if his life depended on it. No suburban disguise, no respectful mask. He's not manipulative. He's not playing the perfect boyfriend. Halbower's not clever. He's not charming. He's not organized. He's a disorganized offender, sloppy, impulsive. His attacks weren't premeditated in the malicious sense. He's also what would be called an opportunistic predator, acting when the moment presented itself. Women waiting for buses, like I had mentioned, or women walking home from school, women stuck in car, having car trouble. So these are ordinary scenarios. He's definitely just taking advantage of those moments. His killings read like bursts of uncontrolled rage rather than carefully staged crimes. And that's the chaotic violence hallmark. The guy couldn't stop himself, even when handed a taste of freedom, like in his 2 prison escapes. He didn't run, he didn't hide, he didn't disappear. I mean, there are people who disappeared for years and then resurfaced. This guy didn't know how to do that. He would immediately commit new violent crimes. That tells us everything about his zero impulse control. He did not have any. So also, I wouldn't be surprised if maybe he had had a traumatic brain injury at some point, just because the zero impulse control. He literally had none. He wasn't scheming long term. He was scratching an itch that he could not resist. Like most sexual predators, his crimes weren't about sex, really. They were about power. The stabbing, the brutality, the way he targeted vulnerable women, it was domination, plain and simple. The sexual assault was the mechanism, but the real satisfaction was overpowering someone and watching that fear and holding the control. There was no trust camouflage, like we had discussed with the cable guy killer. He wasn't pretending to be the nice guy next door. He was a drifter, a transient. His lack of ties gave him cover in a different way. Nobody was paying attention to this man in the first place. So it was almost easy for him. If you look at the classic psychology checklist, Halbower ticks several boxes. He has superficial relationships, failed marriages, transient lifestyle. He's impulsive, so prison escapes, immediate reoffending, criminal versatility. I mean, he was raping, attempted murder itself, homicide, and kidnappings. Lack of empathy or remorse. He never admitted guilt, which is astounding, and he showed no remorse at trial. But notice what he didn't have was that slick charm and the high intelligence that people often mistake as a central part to psychopathy. I really want to drive that home. Not all serial killers are really intelligent. This was a funny conversation that I had with my husband. He was just assuming that most psychopaths are super intelligent or have high IQs. And that's a misnomer. It's not true. And he is a perfect example of that. He was brute force. He was not brain power. The scariest thing about him isn't that he was some evil genius, right? It's that he was mediocre. He was ordinary. He was a violent man who could blend into the background, and then he just exploded repeatedly. And he proves you don't have to be clever to be deadly. Sometimes all it takes is raw violence and the right opportunity. With a guy like him, you don't just close the book at 6 victims and call it a day. The timeline alone screens gaps big enough to hide a body in, and we know about the 1976 murder in Reno, and we know about all those murders in the Bay Area. So that Gypsy Hill cluster that finally tied him down. We know about the 1986 attempted murder in Oregon, Medford, Oregon, where the victim actually survived and was able to identify him. And there's this 10-year black hole, though, in his record. 10 years where he was out drifting up and down the West Coast. 10 years of unaccounted for movements. That's a lot of time for somebody like him to rack up a body count we'll probably never fully uncover. And that's what keeps investigators up at night and keeps me up at night. His lifestyle was the definition of slippery. Nevada, California, Oregon, Washington, all within his roaming radius. A transient predator with no fixed address, no steady job, no long-term ties. That kind of life makes for lousy paper trails and great cover for crimes that vanish into the background, particularly when you're talking about the 1970s and the 1980s. It's not just speculation either. Detectives had said flat out they suspect there are more victims. Women who never made it home, whose cases went cold, and whose deaths were brushed off as random violence, especially back then. With Halbower and his impulsive style, it's not like he planned carefully or left a calling card. His crimes could be hiding in plain sight. Unsolved files, gathering dust, in Reno, in the Bay, or small towns. 6 confirmed victims is just the number we can prove. The reality, with his track record, the geography, and those lost years, an entire decade, it's entirely possible he left a trail far longer, far bloodier than what we've pinned on him. So just swinging around back to Kathy Woods. I really want to close on this. Kathy Woods, who was wrongfully convicted and served 35 years in prison for Michele's death in Reno, she was exonerated in 2015. And she got a $3 million settlement from Washoe County in 2019. She got a $2.85 million settlement from Nevada, the state of Nevada, plus a certificate of innocence. A certificate of innocence. Do you think that she has that framed on her wall? Additional settlements, she got from Reno and others, but they all add up to $9.6 million. But money doesn't buy back decades of life. Kathy walked out in her late 60s. She was robbed of her adulthood. Michele Mitchell, 19 years old, a nursing student whose car broke down on an ordinary Reno night. Kathy Woods, wrongfully imprisoned for 35 years, longest such case for a woman in U.S. history. The Gypsy Hill victims, Veronica, Paula, Carol, Denise, Tanya, young women murdered in everyday moments. And then there's Rodney, a violent drifter who slipped through cracks for decades while police chased the wrong suspect. The legacy is bitter. Reno tied into California's dark history. Forensic science correcting injustice too late, and families left with scars that never healed. As of the most recent records, Rodney is incarcerated at Two Rivers Correctional Institute in Oregon. And this has been confirmed as late as 2020. Now, after finishing that Oregon sentence, if that ever happens, he'll be transferred to California to serve out the rest of his life behind bars. Institution to institution, state to state, the system ain't letting him slip away again. That's it for today's episode of Reno Murders, Death in the Biggest Little City. If you liked what you heard, make sure to follow, rate, and share it with that one friend who's always watching scary movies. Girlfriend, you know I'm talking to you. And I'll be back with more stories from Reno's shadow side. Until then, stay safe, lock your doors, people. The biggest little city may be smiling with its lights, but don't forget, it has teeth. My references and sources used today are referenced in my notes.